I'm fairly certain that a fair proportion of you, my subscribers, consider yourself libertarian, and so with this in mind, I invite you to reply to what I have to say on this topic below in the comments. If you think any of my reasons are insufficient or that I'm missing something crucial, then please let me know, as I'm entirely self-taught, and as such, I appreciate that this makes me vulnerable to missing a thing or two, despite extensive research.
Hello everyone, and welcome to another episode of Perspective Philosophy, where we try to better our perceptions of the world through philosophical discussion. Today I am responding to Rationality Rules, who came out as not a libertarian. I actually agree, right, for the most part with pretty much everything he said, but I think it's good to zoom in a little bit, because in my experience of doing political philosophy at university, you do John Rawls. And then straight after you do John Rawls, you do Robert Nozick. I don't know if you have, but I think if you read Robert Nozick, you'll find yourself agreeing with Robert Nozick just as much as John Rawls, right? And they are very much opposed to each other. It's something that you're going to have to deal with eventually, so we're going to try and delve into it for those that haven't, and hopefully help you learn how to deal with this problem if you haven't already came across it. So here is what Rationality Rules got right and wrong with his video on why he's not a libertarian.
I don't call myself a libertarian because I don't believe in free will, I don't believe in natural rights, and, most crucially and ironically, I don't believe libertarianism represents true liberty.
Now, I actually agree with pretty much all of those points, except for the free will one. I'm a compatibilist, we'll talk about this another time. But I want to focus on two of his points: natural rights and a poor conception of freedom. I do not believe in natural rights myself. I think of them as vacuous and empty. Natural rights really, denote this conception that we have natural inalienable rights. Now, he says John Locke, for example, and which he calls him a libertarian.
Many libertarians, such as John Locke,
no, liberal, classical liberal. Anyway, he calls him a libertarian, says that he believes in natural inalienable rights and that these rights come from God. Well, kind of. In John Locke's second treatise of government, Locke argues that your rights come from yourself, and this is more of your nature rather than, which is God-given for Locke, but it comes from what you are. And so what he's appealing to is human nature. He's saying that you own yourself, for example. That's why you own your property, because he says that property is a mixture of labor and natural ingredients. So you take a field, you plow it, it becomes yours because you put yourself into the field. You've mixed your labor into the natural ingredients to create something which is yours because it is constituted as part of yourself. Okay, and because you own yourself, you own the field. Okay, and I actually really love this understanding of property law, or at least property rights. This ability to appeal to your own labor as the reason to why you would own something. That being said, John Locke had the benefit of appealing to God.
But I, as an atheist, obviously don't find this convincing. And what's more, even if I was a Christian like Locke, I'd still reject his assertion, as in my opinion, the Bible explicitly states that it's perfectly fine to deprive certain people of liberty.
As contemporary philosophers, we wouldn't make such appeals to authority. But we do need to appeal to something. So John Locke surprisingly influenced John Rawls. And that's who you love. So if you're taking John Rawls' theory of justice, you have to know that John Rawls' theory of justice was pretty much built on John Locke. I mean, it is really inspired by John Locke. But it also inspired Robert Nozick. So how can this one thinker, this one conception of value, inspire two separate, opposing ideological stances within the space of 300 years? Now, that's the question that you're going to have to deal with. How do you choose between John Rawls and Robert Nozick? Because their values are what are called incommensurable. They cannot speak to each other and actually make any headway. So John Rawls argues that we should take the original position, as you say. The original position is a place of unbias. This place of unbias removes all knowledge of property rights already existing. It removes all knowledge of natural abilities, capabilities, intellectual abilities, anything that you could possibly have a social advantage of, and places you in a position where you do not know who you are going to be. Okay, and he says that that's where you should be drawing up the rules of society. Because if you didn't know how you were going to be born, if you didn't know what social advantages you were going to be given, then you would be in a better place to decide what was right and wrong, what's fair and what's not. Now, that seems like a pretty good idea, like the idea of just pure blind justice as fairness, as it's called. But Robert Nozick makes a criticism. He says, well, one, like, to do this is just, it's almost naive. Money and items and labor don't rain from as manna from heaven, as he calls it, right? People already own things. Now, if you are a person who's working class and you're having your property taken from you to give to someone who makes a social decision to not work, for example, to perhaps have children, or, you know, the even just unlucky, then you're being punished. You're having something that you're entitled to taken from you. And he calls this the entitlement principle. The entitlement to what is actually owned is something that has to exist in a conception of the world that already is.
If people determine the basic structure of society behind a veil of ignorance, which would deprive them of information about their specific characteristics such as their ethnicity, social status, and gender, they would create a welfare state. They'd elect a society that maximizes the prospects of the worst off, because they themselves might be the worst off. They'd create a society that would ensure that if they or their loved ones were born blind, deaf, or dumb, they'd nevertheless have a life worth living. Thus, this is the primary reason I'm not a libertarian.
I would also like to point out Robert Nozick does argue for a welfare system, at least somewhat. He argues for what he calls the principle of compensation, saying that we do need a welfare state, but not the kind of welfare state that forces you to contribute because, you know, you need to help people, but because you benefit from society. You require a society to function, a justice system, for example. For that to function properly, those who are disadvantaged by not having social opportunity will then cause a hiccup in society. Things start not working. You could just, you know, try and like pay for it as it comes along, or you can just offer a universal system where you basically say, like, if you're under a certain point, you're going to get compensated. And he says that is probably going to be cheaper, more effective, so you should do it. So he does allow for a welfare state, just a kind of an egoistical one. But at the same time, I actually love the principle of compensation and the principle of entitlement as well. And I think you will too, because Robert Nozick's arguments are strong. Robert Nozick is a very, very capable thinker, and he was left-wing before he was right-wing. So he has a very good understanding of liberal values before he even starts writing the book. And his book is Anarchy, State and Utopia, which I recommend that you read. But there is someone else I would like to bring into this, because as you can see, one is arguing that we need a welfare state to help the poor, the needy, you know, the people who are downtrodden and need help. And on the other hand, you have a person who is arguing for the rights of property and self-ownership, and how can anyone be entitled to what I earn kind of mentality. The liberal versus the libertarian. The point is that they will both appeal to natural rights, right? And that's why I really do appreciate that Rationality Rules does not like natural rights, because I think they're vacuous. There's nothing there. And the reason I think they're vacuous is because of a thinker called Alistair McIntyre. I love Alistair McIntyre. I would get Alistair McIntyre's face tattooed on my face. I love Alistair McIntyre that much, right? Such a guy. Alistair McIntyre argues that the problem with Rawls and Nozick is that they just can't talk to each other. They can't appeal to a value set which combines why they would care about the needy, the downtrodden, and the people in the original position, or why they would care about property rights and inalienable rights. You're talking about two separate conceptions of rights. You're talking about the right to life, education, so on, the right to property. How do you appeal to that? And he actually gives a really good example of a case where this happened. There was these poor kids from America took the state to court. And what happened was they were taking the state to court because the education was not providing an adequate literacy skills to those students of these schools, right? And they lost because the judge argued that a right to education is not necessarily a right to literacy. Now, how ridiculous does that sound? Oh, we're going to educate you, but there's no standard from which we have to educate you. You just have to get an education. Now, luckily, this was overturned, and these students actually ended up winning later on. But the point is, was the judge even wrong? What is a right to education? So the question is, where do property rights begin and end? Where does my right to ownership of what I have around me begin, and where does it end? Does it end where my body ends? Does it end where my labour ends? Does it end where my money ends? And there's different conceptions of where property begins and ends within this idea of the right to one's property. There's different conceptions of what education and welfare are. There's different conceptions of all of these rights that are totally incommensurable. What we need to understand is ethics itself. Why do we make a rights-based system in the first place? So this is where Alistair McIntyre comes in, because McIntyre is arguing that the reason why we can't make any headway politically is because we're talking two separate languages about an issue which we're both right about, right? We're both right in the sense that we're appealing to a conception of what is good and bad, but we'll have two separate conceptions of good and bad. That's why we're not making any headway, because one is using one rationality and one is using another. They're two separate traditions colliding, or arguably the same tradition that's just branched. Now, this is something that we need to bridge, and the way that we'll bridge it is through discourse, is through an ethical institution in which we can appeal to a joint value. And this is why you need moral objectivism, because moral objectivism allows us to appeal to the values of ourselves and other people. The reason why we have property rights is to protect people's property, to protect the people from theft, to protect it from, unlawful seizure from the government, etc. And the reason that we'll have educational rights and welfare rights is to protect people from, going to hospital and having their organs removed. Now, these are appealing to notions of right and wrong. And unless we can see why one theory is better than another, then we're not actually going to be able to give a justification for either side. So although they both seem right, they're actually both also wrong. To be right in the first place is to enter a Hegelian dialectic. Now, that is to enter a conception of discussion where we can talk about what is right or wrong. We need to be able to speak the same language, and to do that, we need to appeal to the same conception of the world. We don't necessarily have to have universal understandings of rights. We can make agreements. So, for example, if we enter an anarchical syndicate and we were to create a welfare within our company, we can agree as members of our company how much we're willing to pay our employees, for example, what the property rights constitute and how much we need to give to the corporation. We would be paid the value of our labour. We would also be able to agree on, protections for our employees, for their families. Now, I'll talk more about this in the future in an episode on Alistair McIntyre and moral objectivism, particularly on his two books, After Virtue, which I would recommend reading wholeheartedly, and Whose Justice and Which Rationality. So moving on to his third criticism of libertarianism, which is his rejection of a poor conception of freedom within libertarianism.
Most crucially, and ironically, I don't believe libertarianism represents true liberty. True liberty, in my opinion, requires equal opportunity, and libertarianism doesn't deliver this. In fact, to the contrary, it protects those arbitrarily dealt good cards and leaves those arbitrarily dealt bad cards to die. It addresses freedom from, but it utterly fails to address freedom to.
Now, I agree with that. And it's not real freedom for the reasons I actually talked about earlier. When you look at Hegelian conceptions of freedom, what it means to be free, it means to be uncaused and unrestricted. So this is sometimes called positive and negative freedom. Okay, so to be uncaused would mean to not be, caused by A, B, or C. So your actions aren't caused by your desires, for example, like immediate desires, like urges, compulsions. your actions are your own. You've deliberated these actions. This is Sartre. Unrestricted freedom is more like Thomas Hobbes. You're free when you achieve your desires. You're free when you're unrestricted, when you get what you want. So that seems very, positive and negative, very polar opposite. So how to merge these together? How to become uncaused and unrestricted? Hegel manages to do this in his conception of freedom within the book The Philosophy of Right, which is another book I'd recommend, but that is a hefty read. So I would say even a reader's guide. A guy called David Rose does a really good reader's guide on Hegel's Philosophy of Right. Really great. Within Hegel's conception of freedom, what we have to understand is that we need to be uncaused, which means we need to reject our desires, at least seemingly, and we also need to complete our desires. It seems a bit difficult to do, but what we do is we set up a situation where we deliberate over our value sets. We deliberate over our desires. So we say, is this the right thing to do? Should I want to do this? And it pulls into question who we are. Once we're in that situation, we can choose to accept a second order desire. So not just that which is immediately presented to us by our bodies. So we might be, really hungry and might be craving pizza. We might choose not to have pizza because we want to, be in better shape. Now, that would be an expression of freedom because we're immediately presented value for a second order desire. I might reduce healthcare costs on my state. I might be able to live long enough to look after my children. And there may be reasons behind it in which we can appeal to. So these reasons are deliberative. We've had to force ourselves to really evaluate who we are, and what we truly want. And that is real freedom. So I do appreciate that libertarians don't usually understand this version of freedom. And they see freedom as just being unrestricted. Can I do what I want? I want to live the life I want to live. Don't get in my way and I won't get in your way. Unrestricted freedom. But they lack the Sartrean concept of being uncaused. And so they're a slave to their desires. They're a slave to their whims, as Ayn Rand would say. And a whim is a desire from which the desirer doesn't care to know the cause of the desire. And to evaluate this is objective freedom. And it's objective morality, it's ethics. And that's why Ayn Rand, even though she's an egoist, is an objectivist. The Virtue of Selfishness has a nice, neat little chapter at the start, just explaining objectivist ethics for egoists. Great. Alistair McIntyre, after Virtue. I would also recommend John Locke's second treatise of government, John Rawls, A Theory of Justice, and Robert Nozick, Anarchy, State, and Utopia. So all of the books I've mentioned will be in the description below. You can see if you want to buy them, or if you could even get your library to order them in. They are really important reads, especially for people who are doing political philosophy. I would wholeheartedly recommend Robert Nozick, John Rawls, and John Locke. I don't think you can do political philosophy without those three. I hope you've enjoyed this video. I hope you can see that I really, for the most part, do actually agree with Rationality Rules. I just think that he needs to be able to appeal to something to support John Rawls. Because if he's going to want to support a liberal value set, then he's going to need to show why it's better than another one. Why it's better than Robert Nozick's conception of entitlement. Why we're going to appeal to something like welfare over property rights. Or why freedom is actually constituted not as a libertarian conception, but why we're freed by laws and conventions which govern our behaviours as Hegel would have it. So I hope you've all enjoyed this video. Subscribe for more videos like this one. And as always, try to gain some perspective.